Good evening. It's April 2020. I'm Robin Strachan, surgeon turned philosopher, for an hour or so once again. I'm very honoured and grateful to the Barnes Philosophy Club Committee, and of course Barbie in particular, for asking me to talk to the club again in this series of talks on ethics, besides so many distinguished speakers, even if it is now only on video due to the pandemic. My subject is about Bertrand Russell and his ethics. This is the first of two talks about how his ethics change with time, related to life events, and to ask the question why. I'm particularly interested in his relationship with psychology and how that can be linked to the understanding of ethical positions. Part 2 moves upwards literally and metaphorically to higher order thought about how ethical positions seem to affect philosophical, social and political positions, and how apparent complexity of human thought and human insight can be broken down into understandable patterns and groupings using the ethical understanding discussed in Part 1, and how language can be disguised to alter truth features heavily. We are hoping to set up a Skype or Zoom meeting after this video is distributed to the club. I hope you enjoy the talk, and I look forward to seeing you all online. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Bertrand Russell significantly changed his philosophical and ethical positions over time, as in a journey, transiting from normative idealism in his early years to the opposite extreme of skepticism and the founder of meta-ethics in middle age. In his later years he moved to a more Humean, empiricist middle position. This talk is therefore about defining and charting these changes using a system which combines philosophical and psychological ideas. In part 1 of this talk, I hope to discuss lower order thought in the individual, with particular interest in expressivism and emotivism to be analysed using psychometrics in order to determine different ethical positions. In part 2, I hope to look at higher order thought within groups, and analysing perspectivism using psychometrics to determine philosophical positions. Please don't switch off yet. This is very much a talk on philosophy and with psychometrics as a bonus. Indeed, this talk also highlights Russell's relationship with emotivism and psychology, and my favourite Russell quote of all is, "Emotions drive the attitudes which distort our ethical norms." We will of course discuss what emotions and norms are, but what I find almost incredible is that, despite saying these words and despite being a mathematician and founder of analytic philosophy, he never attempted to bridge what I would like to call the great divide between numbers in psychology and mainly use of words in philosophy, a divide which sadly persists to the present day. Now, many philosophers have tried to develop theories of everything to explain ethics, for example, Descartes' dualism or Hegel's absolute idealism. And such reductionism attempts to analyse and describe complex phenomena in terms of its simple or fundamental constituents. However, commensurability in ethics is a problem with all such theories when two values, ethical norms, reasons or goods, do not share a common standard of measurement and cannot therefore be compared to each other in any certain way, as frequently encountered in ethical writings, and therefore becomes incommensurability, which indicates a need for a common standard of measurement in ethics. My question is, can psychometrics provide the solution to incommensurability of values and norms? In other words, if Russell is right about emotions driving our attitudes, perhaps we need to create a psychometric philosophical paradigm, PPP, linking numbers with words. where psychologically driven reductionism can be used to explain individual variation in personalized ethics and why some people's morality might deviate from so-called norms caused by variation in emotional states. Helping therefore to define what could then be called ranges of abnorms. So why choose Russell as best example? Well, I wrote a school essay about Russell the year he died, about how he made sense of the world and its complexities with 60 excellent books and 2,000 articles, and his Nobel Prize for Literature on humanitarianism and freedom of thought. Best known as a practical moralist, promoting ethical normativism. And what norms actually are, I hope to debate later. He later joined the revolt against idealism and was one of the first in the field of emotivism and error theory, helping to found metaethics, which in my opinion links very well with psychometrics. Also, Russell's works are highly accessible and well documented, particularly about how his philosophical positions change with time, for example in Ray Monk's very helpful biography, Spirit of Solitude. Now this abbreviated biographical timeline is mainly here for reference. If you don't know his biography very well, best to pause the talk now to take it all in. But Russell certainly had an interesting life, and we will refer to the major episodes later, but here I am mainly interested in his main publications as shown on the right of the slide. We can skip over Principia Mathematica and the founding of analytics, which we discussed last time, but should carefully note Element of Ethics in his 1910 philosophical essays, and then Problems of Philosophy in 1912. Now things get very interesting in Analysis of Mind in 1921, where he references psychologists such as John Watson. Then comes Religion and Science in 1935, then skipping over History of Western Philosophy, I hope to focus on the more obscure Reply to Criticism in 1946, and finally Human Society and Ethics and Politics in 1954. These particular works I think best show Russell's ethical development with time, and will be mentioned again in due course. Sincere apologies. But in order to develop the psychometric philosophical paradigm that helps explain Russell's ethical journey, I have to briefly run through some basic psychometrics, so here we go. Of course, before anyone had heard of psychology, everyone knew the proto-dimensions and dualisms such as evil versus good, Dionysus versus Apollo, hell versus heaven, yin versus yang, dark versus light, sinister versus dexter, etc., that framed the morality of the time. Blue or white light has always tended to represent goodness and positivity, and red and black darkness always tends to represent evil or negativity, which explains the color coding in the diagrams you will see later in the talk. So, keeping the concept of opposites in mind, personality theory goes of course right back to 2nd century Galen, but with Lavater's 18th century classic 4 types of personality being melancholy, choleric, phlegmatic and sanguine as shown here. Then Golden Allport of genotype-phenotype fame updates Lavater and is crucial to the development of psychometrics in the 1940s by his creation of a series of psychological value scales or dimensions by the analysis of 18,000 words and terms, putting them into sets of polar opposites or antonyms in a manner similar to Aristotle's excesses, means and deficiencies. But just before Allport, Carl Jung created his extroversion-introversion dimension in 1921, which can be placed by psychometric convention running across a rectangular box like so. Please bear with me for the moment about positivity being at the top right corner and negativity at the bottom left corner of this diagram. We are therefore beginning to create a simple 10 by 10 grid where psychology and philosophy can be overlaid and compared. Now some of you might have heard of a London psychologist called Hans Eyesenck, who in 1947 described the so-called neurotic, non-neurotic or unstable stable dimension as shown here, and again by convention with stable being top right and unstable bottom left. He was the first to work properly in 2-dimensional psychometrics as shown here. His act of genius was to cross the Jungian introversion-extroversion scale, shown here as horizontal, with his unstable stable axis, shown here as vertically orientated. And he noted how Lavater's 4 moods of man fitted well into the 4 quadrants as shown. But something interesting happens when you flip and rotate Eyesenck's diagram, so that it now fits well onto a rectangular grid where aggression and self-esteem form the X and Y axes respectively.
Extroversion and introversion can now be seen to cross obliquely from top left to bottom right, and the stable and unstable dimension crosses from top right to bottom left. Dominant alpha personalities can be placed top left, and submissive beta personalities can be placed bottom right. Positivity and negativity are once again as shown. This grid now not only correlates well with the rest of personality theory, but also becomes very useful in plotting ethical and philosophical positions. Conventional psychology describes 4 behavioral styles as shown. Top left is the driver or alpha negative who likes to be in charge, is opinionated, makes fast decisions, and under stress becomes autocratic. Bottom left we have the so-called expressive type, beta negative, who is noisy, likes change, and is socially demanding, but who under stress becomes offensive and sarcastic. Bottom right we have the beta positive, amiable, supportive type, conforming, quiet, and seeking reassurance, but who under stress submits. However, the top right alpha positive or so-called analytic person is the most interesting in terms of who is most likely to create ethical norms, seeking truth, accuracy and precision, disliking surprises, and who under pressure will withdraw. However, most people most of the time are resting emotionally, ambivalent and calm, as it were in the center of the grid in the purple zone, but always with the possibility of being shifted by circumstances to a new location determined by their personality type, the strength of any stimulus, and prior conditioning, and with the possibility of extreme behaviors if pushed far out to the edges of the grid. So here we see the 4 main personality types, dealing with others at their respective corners of the grid, and they are remarkably easy to recognize. But it's still a social taboo to classify people like this unless you're a psychiatrist. The top right positive hero is in gratitude mode. The alpha is being bossy as usual top left. The panicky bottom right beta person is needing reassurance, and the negative angry skeptic needs most effort by standing up to his bullying, then befriending him. The general aim therefore is to move all of them towards the center of the grid and a state of calm. So here we see the psychometric grid, or Moodgrid, ready for general use. The primary psychological dimension X is driven negatively by levels of aggression and positively by compassion. Y is driven by self-esteem positively and self-pity negatively. Negativity is bottom left at coordinates 0, 0, and positivity at top right at coordinates 10, 10. In the corners we have the associated emotions and moods, with love and euphoria top right, anger and dominance top left, hate and sullenness bottom left, and fear and passivity bottom right. Calm and reason, of course, lies at the center. One other point to make is that the fight-flight dimension seems to run as shown. Can we actually compare the attitude analysis of psychology with linguistic analysis in philosophy? The psychologist Raymond Cattell built upon Allport's work on value scales and attitude analysis by word analysis, and whose 16 attitudinal dimensions are shown here, which still form the basis of personality testing today. By looking at the meaning of the extremes of these value scales, it is possible to orientate these dimensions on the main 2-dimensional grid. It is then fascinating to see how the Cattell dimensions cover the grid as shown, although originally this may not have been intentional. If we take just one example, we can see how the E dimension, assertive to humble, highlighted in red, runs from the top left to bottom right as you would expect according to levels of self-esteem and aggression. Please bear with me and keep this grid in mind as we move on to the next section on ethical theory. Ethical theory has 2 prime divisions. Firstly, normative ethics, which criticizes practical ethics, studies the nature of virtue, i.e. right and wrong, and the consequences of our actions, and as such is the direct heir to traditional idealism and Aristotle. Use of the term normative, however, can be confusing, as norms aren't really normality as such. The second division is meta-ethics, about the meaning of moral judgments, justification of actions, practical solutions, and the function of morality, truth and falsehood, and is more skeptical and dismissive of naive obsessions with moral perfection. One main theory as to why the division is necessary is because our moral judgments are in some way related to expressions of emotion. Logic says yes to this, and has led on to the development of certain branches of metaethics, including the emotivism of error and the error theory promoted by Russell himself, and more of this later. So, virtue ethics is the idealistic gold standard we are familiar with, Aristotle teaching Alexander the Great and all that, whereas mentioned before, normative ethics emphasizes virtues of mind and character, truth and honesty, and the consequences of our actions. Bear with me about the red rectangle and the blue square seen top right. The blue square designates this particular positive philosophical position of idealism on a very simple grid where philosophical and psychological ideas can be overlaid. This character-based approach to morality assumes we acquire virtue through practice. By being honest, brave, just and generous, a person develops an honourable and moral character. According to Aristotle, by holding virtuous habits, people will be likely to make the right ethical choices even when challenged. But given the lessons of history, this has always been seen by skeptics as naive. So no apologies then for showing somebody evil, and a picture is sometimes worth 1,000 words. Now this question as to whether people are evil, good, or just crazy is extremely difficult to answer in ethical terms, and more of this later. And as Russell himself said, we need methods to analyze these falsehoods and metaphysical mistakes, which in philosophical terms means the study of ethical norms and using meta-ethics to answer why people might develop extreme abnormative beliefs. And with my belief being that attitude analysis and personality theory can indeed be linked to meta-ethics. It's time to define meta-ethics. Applied ethics and normative theory focuses upon what is moral, usually by looking at a series of ethical dichotomies, whereas meta-ethics focuses upon what morality itself is. Meta-ethics, therefore, is a branch of analytic philosophy that explores the status, foundations and scope of moral values, properties and words. Which brings us to normativism and an introduction to the so-called fact-value debate. Quoting Jemima Ben Menahem, normativism spans a series of interrelated dichotomies that lie at the heart of philosophical inquiry, which accentuates gaps between fact and value. Our good friend Sophie Grace Chappell recently wrote similarly that challenges to the supposed fact-value gap have alleged consequences for philosophy, so this is all pretty topical. So to my mind, we do need a system to define and separate empirical fact from subjective values, using psychology to understand how emotion distorts those values, thereby creating sets of ethical abnorms. Having now read many papers on metaethics, I counted about 20 main subdivisions of metaethical method as shown here, but my eureka moment was when I realized they could be subdivided into two main categories. Firstly, the analytic linguistic group shown here in brown seem linked to analytic philosophy and linguistics, in comparison with the emotivist expressivist grouping shown in green, which have very strong links to psychology. Some methods such as expressivism seem to deal mainly with lower orders of thought, in comparison with a method such as perspectivism, which deals mainly with higher levels of thought and insight, and we will look at these particular two methods in more detail later. So to start with expressivism, Simon Blackburn in his book Ruling Passions states that in metaethics, expressivism is a theory about the meaning of moral language, where the primary function of moral sentences is not to assert any matter of fact, but rather to express an evaluative attitude towards an object of evaluation. Of course, that is music to a psychologist's ear, as this statement mirrors, as it were, the attitude analysis seen in psychometrics that we discussed earlier. Then, in his little book on ethics being good, I was pleased to see him in this paragraph putting relativism and nihilism in the same place as skepticism as threats to ethical theory, and would agree with him that such notions are not easy and are open invitations to confusion. However, when he says an ethic will crystallize our attitudes to the most important events, I would say, hang on, what about the other way round? Psychological attitudes do determine and even distort the way we view events, and therefore could drive our ethics and explain the need for metaethics, and more of this later. Moving on now to higher order thought and perspectivism, this is possibly an original piece of genius by Marcus Aurelius. everything we hear is an opinion, not a fact, and everything we see is a perspective, not the truth. So perspectivism seems to mean consideration of different philosophical vantage points, which alter perceptions and distort our reality, in psychological terms, cognitive distortion. And to create those vantage points, as it were, synonyms and antonyms of psychological attitudes readily give the extremes the meaning and their polar opposites to create the dimensions, and then the mathematical model to facilitate systematization of perspectivist thought, and thereby create measurable definitions of what, for example, constitutes degrees of good and evil. So I think we are now ready to study Russell's timeline of ethical development. Russell did therefore undergo significant change in his life from idealist to skeptic, along what I believe to be the axis that forms the prime dialectic of philosophy, from positive blue idealist to negative red skeptic. And we have to now ask ourselves why and how he made this particular philosophical journey in order to shed light on how such things happen. Russell started life as a reluctant aristocrat from a Whig family involved in public affairs, being a cultivated aesthete who loved nature and was still at this time proud of his family status. He seems to have started life as a Kantian-inspired logical rationalist with some influence from Benthamite utilitarianism, being keen on practical solutions for the benefit of the majority. Bear with me again, this rather dogmatic rationalist position is represented by the top left black square. However, on going up to do mathematics at Cambridge, he starts to make the shift towards Hegel, Aristotelian virtue ethics, idealism, and the normativism we mentioned earlier. At this time he said, "Three passions, simple but overwhelmingly strong, have governed my life: the longing for love, the search for knowledge, and unbearable pity for the suffering of mankind." So this nice, heroic, romantic, and quasi-metaphysical statement says it all about how his attitudes were then, as an analytic and idealist, shown here as a move to the top right blue area on the grid. So here again is a representation of the prime dialectic of philosophy, showing the eternal struggle, as it were, between the positive, idealistic, objectivist, virtue ethical, cognitivist, and normativist main philosophical position of the ancients, represented here in blue, versus the skeptical, negative challenge of subjectivism, non-cognitivism, and abnormativist position shown as the red square in the opposite corner of the grid. And to differing degrees, everything else lies between these two main positions. But I also hope later to use Russell to help identify and argue for the existence of three other main abnormative positions or areas on the grid as shown, namely rationalism in black, empiricism in purple, and asceticism in yellow, making five main philosophical positions in all. So here is Russell's timeline, showing him occupy different positions on the now colour-coded grid at different times in his life, being almost a full circle, starting as a mild rationalist Kantian utilitarian, represented top left, then in Cambridge as a young man becoming more of an idealistic objectivist, well-versed in virtue ethics, top right, then later in life after World War I, influenced by Ayer and others, becoming more interested in practical forms of emotivism and religiosity, seen as bottom right. But then, influenced by life events and World War II, as well as receiving criticism from people such as Wittgenstein, he moved to the bottom left into a much more sceptical, subjectivist position before finally moving back into a more centred and balanced Humean, Enlightenment-type empiricist position in the 1950s, where he is seen here reflecting again upon heaven and hell. Sorry about how busy the slide is, but again feel free to hit pause to take it all in. But it shows in a similar format the timing of Russell's major publications in green in relation to the five philosophical positions. He did not write much about his early utilitarian rationalism before Cambridge, but Elements of Ethics in 1910 epitomizes the conventional idealistic virtue ethics containing right conduct, normative, cognitive, objectivist positions as inspired by G.E. Moore's 1903 Principia, with a strong Aristotelian input. Major events at this time in Russell's life include World War I, Bolshevism, pacifism, and criticism of his theories of good by Santayana in 1913. So it is no surprise to find Russell shifting his position towards emotivism and identification with philosophers such as Ayer and Schopenhauer, being therefore more accepting of the weaknesses of human nature, now as more of a non-cognitivist. It is therefore no coincidence that Russell wrote Religion and Science in 1935, which takes a more pragmatic and even metaphysical emotive position where compassion and goodness is highly appreciated. But then comes a fairly predictable shift to the bottom left. After the horrors of World War II and Hiroshima, man's inhumanity to man, we see Russell's deep skeptical despair as he develops his more subjective meta-ethical theories with replying to criticism in 1946 after Wittgenstein's attacks, before in later life moving into the empirical centre ground of Humean reason, writing the highly insightful and semi-consequentialist political and social arguments found in Human Society in Ethics and Politics in 1954. So what does cognitive actually mean? In psychology, cognitive means a focus upon mental processes such as perception, memory, learning, solving problems, etc. caused by stimuli. Psychologists use cognitivist perspectives seeking to understand such cognition. Of particular interest are so-called cognitive distortions, which can have selfish and malevolent effects. In philosophy, however, non-cognitivism or irrealism means that moral statements can have no substantial truth conditions and therefore be in error. Cognitivism, sometimes known as constructivism or realism, then becomes the denial of non-cognitivism. Thus, non-cognitivism holds that moral statements do express beliefs, but that they are apt for both truth and falsity. So in his early cognitivist phase in Cambridge, under the influence of Moore, he was chosen to join the debating society called the Apostles, the main mantra being that what is good may not always coincide with what we desire, but what we can desire to desire may also be good or even better. But the terms are not synonymous and leads to a form of paradox. For example, Epicurean pleasure and happiness are not always for the good, leading to a rejection of hedonism, thereby avoiding a paradise of ecstatic bestiality, unquote, which does seem a bit of a shame to me. Now, this cognitive logic was challenged by the so-called open question argument or publicity condition naturalistic fallacy raised by G.E. Moore in Principia Ethica in 1903, which refutes equating the property of goodness with some non-moral property, such as pleasure or the supernatural, for example, God's command. And to my mind, such denial of metaphysics is what opens the way to a scientific basis of understanding what good or evil actually means. Also in his early cognitive phase, Russell follows the concepts of the common good, including Aristotelian type analysis of consequences, such that the best happiness as a concept comes from making others happy, having only loving relations without hedonism, and as such being a bit like Stoicism proper. Now, this position is not quite the absolute idealism of Hegelian metaphysics, being more like baseline virtue ethics, but it is still opposed to the harsh pragmatism of the rationalists like Kant or extreme utilitarianism or early 20th century skepticism. But there was a perceived need to harness positive creative impulses as opposed to negative selfish ones. Therefore, by 1920, inspired by Moore, he had been working on his error theory, where he considered that falsehoods can propagate through morality, and that morality can be compounded by falsehoods and metaphysical mistakes, and that there is no such thing as absolute good or badness, as their properties are impossible to define. They are only empty phrases. This error theory post-World War I is therefore an important turning point for Russell, with a shift towards non-cognitivism, presaging Russell's contribution to metaethics. For me, however, speaking of empty phrases is defeatist talk, because metaethics with psychometrics can and should be used together to define norms and abnorms. So after World War I and disillusionment with Bolshevik Russia and disaster in China, Russell yearns for moral truth and loses faith in the concept of the Marian good, and is now well on his way to becoming more of a moral skeptic, observing ongoing difficulty in reconciling ethical objectivity with an individual's belief and conscience, i.e. becoming somewhat more subjective, best represented by the more intermediate, compassionate, bottom right position as shown in yellow. So, Russell's concept of the human good at this stage is no longer as polarized as, say, between Marx, who is skeptically directing the proletariat, and Aristotle's virtuous individual responsibilities. He now follows the logic expressed in A.J. Ayer's Language, Truth and Logic in 1936, and to my mind becomes more emotivistic. So what was Ayer's truth theory? In Language, Truth and Logic in 1936, Ayer presents the verification principle as the only valid basis for philosophy. Unless logical or empirical verification is possible, statements like God exists or charity is good are not true or untrue, but meaningless, and may thus be excluded or ignored. So truth theory is about content-to-world or word-to-world relations. What we say or think is true or false only in terms of the way the world turns out to be. But in my opinion, like error theory, it still doesn't explain how or why abnormative morality occurs. On the subject of truth values, I quote the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. The problem with truth now lies, however, in the interpretation of connectives and logical operators in contexts that are partially lacking truth values, or as psychologists would say, cognitive distortions. And this so-called Frege-Geich problem about truth values is independent of whether non-cognitivists think that moral sentences can be true or false. Answers about the nature of norms are not easy, as minimalism about truth does not solve the problem of applying norms to moral judgments. Jorgensen's dilemma is also about having to make inferences regarding the application of norms to value judgments. So it's all about those pesky norms again. As we know, Wittgenstein, the arch-skeptic in 1946, wrecked Russell's confidence as shown here, praising his mathematics but wanting to ban his philosophical work, therefore perhaps unwittingly demonstrating his totalitarian tendencies. For me, not a nice person. To be fair to Wittgenstein's level of insight, in his early work, the Tractatus, he did state that language disguises thought, so much so that from the outward form of the clothing it is impossible to infer the thought beneath it. In his later period in Investigations in 1958, he stated, "We remain unconscious of the prodigious diversity of all the everyday language games, because the clothing of our language makes everything alike." Indeed, a lot of nice things have been said about his genuine philosophical understanding, but for me he will always be a skeptic and a cynical, anti-systematic to the last. So where does that leave us? With constructivism, along with objectivism being forms of idealism, and expressivism, along with, for example, subjectivism, being forms of skepticism. They seem to face off, as it were, along the philosophical dimension, with expressivism dismissing the role of language in particular, and idealism through its error and truth theories making apologies for it. To my mind, both are wrong, as it were being extreme views. And to my mind, there is demonstrated here an obvious need for an empiricist, science-based analysis of the meaning of language, to explain the ways in which language can be used, either disguised to form deception and lies at one end of the dimension, or naive blinkered truth at the other extreme. So coming back to Russell, he responds to the criticism from Wittgenstein and others in 1946 like so. I am accused of inconsistency, perhaps justly, because although I hold ultimate ethical valuations to be subjective, I nevertheless allow myself emphatic opinions on ethical questions. If there is an inconsistency, it is one that I cannot get rid of without insincerity. Moreover, an inconsistent system may well contain less falsehood than a consistent one. For my own sake, as well as for that of the reader, I propose to examine this question somewhat fully. Russell now seems desperate to be seen to be subjective and even sceptical, on one side of the argument, but still clinging to his idealism on the other, but still driven to explain ethical fallacies empirically by developing his meta-ethics. So Russell now shifts from emotivism to skepticism at this time, affecting his metaethics, which coincides with anti-war sentiment, acknowledgement of the subjectivity of moral values, and contemplation of evil and hell. The severity of his skepticism is such that he loses confidence in science to help explain the concepts of good and evil, and as such this seems another lost opportunity for him to return to psychological techniques. He still, however, continues to look for simplicity and to improve definitions of truth value in moral judgments. Later, his skepticism becomes even more intense, and some quotes include, "False intuitions might become related to wrong perceptions of goodness. Real properties of goodness and badness do not account for the phenomenology of individual value judgments, and that moral constructs are subject to individual beliefs. And the diversity of moral codes is probably due to variation in upbringing, indoctrination, and temperamental bias." Again here, when using the word temperamental, he is so frustratingly close to using attitude analysis and psychometrics. And by acknowledging these psychological factors, he does very much seem to be leaving the door open to empirical science. Indeed, in his late phase of life, Russell seems to move back towards human empiricism when he says moral psychology is based upon preventing reason being the slave of passions and suppressing wants and desires. He was fascinated by impulses leading to pleasure, causing longer-term purposes to be sacrificed, while accepting that people are still social beings. But ever the idealist, he also says we cannot give in to selfish and antisocial impulses. So in summary, Russell in early life as an ethical theorist always believed that if subjectivity of value was recognized as a problem, then there would be less cruelty, persecution, and moral reprobation in the world, a fairly classical normative objectivist position, and this was maintained largely unchanged throughout his life, including romantic and persisting virtue ethical ideas. However, he did later believe in a prophetic way in the fallibility of metaethical doctrine, which might be used to justify evil acts. His views, therefore, on the nature, justification, and status of moral judgments did change, but still trying to show loyalty to his past beliefs. For example, saying, "Morality is routinely compounded by falsehoods and metaphysical mistakes," skeptical, "but that the good life is inspired by love," idealism, and guided by knowledge, empiricism, thereby taking three philosophical positions at once. The next short section is about Russell's relationship with psychology. Right at the beginning of his career, he gave a paper to the Apostles Debating Society in Cambridge, "Is Ethics a Branch of Empirical Psychology?" This paper was denounced by his mentor, G.E. Moore, but contained some great questions and ideas such as, "Is good only what we desire to desire?" And Russell did influence Moore on his definitions of good, where good is seen as a function of consciousness and aestheticism. And the subjective-objective distinction becomes very relevant here in terms of accepting that generally people do have their own subjective mindset. So Russell was thinking psychology, but at that time, unfortunately, it was not really a science. Also, Russell's 1921 book, Analysis of Mind, shows that he had started to think in more experience and behaviourist ways, as exemplified by John Watson from Johns Hopkins University, who was a disciple of Pavlov and helped pioneer psychological methods. Russell quotes Watson's book Introduction to Comparative Psychology from 1914 6 times in Analysis of Mind, but of course, to be fair to Russell, psychometrics proper with value scales was still over 30 years away. Russell's early emotivism was also influenced by being involved in the Journal of Applied Psychology, Philosophy and Scientific Method, which ran from 1898 to 1921. He states in 1917 that in all ethical questions are feelings, and in Analysis of Mind in 1921, it's, of course, focused upon emotivism. In 1935, he says, expressing values such as good or evil, truth or falsehood, does not belong to ethics, but to psychology or biography. And in 1946, he says, ethics contains statements which are still one of emotion and feeling. Now, roughly contemporaneous with Russell's career, you can see that Jung published his extroversion-introversion theory in 1921, Cattell publishes his first attitudinal dimension theory in 1940, and Eyesenck publishes his two-dimensional theory in 1947. Really not that far apart chronologically. So my question now, if I met Bertie for a drink, would be, Why, despite your first ever paper to the Apostles in Cambridge being on the subject of empirical psychology, did you not make a formal link in your meta-ethics between the emotivism of Ayer and personality theory after World War II? To be fair to him, perhaps he was too tired, preoccupied with CND, perhaps he never recovered from the criticism from Moore in 1903, and also psychometrics was still a long way from being mainstream at that time. So finally, psychometrics can at last meet up with ethics and philosophy. So in a psychometric philosophical paradigm, psychologically driven reductionism could be used to explain variation in personalized ethics and why some people's morality might deviate from so-called norms caused by variation in emotional states, and how emotions and wishes distort our thinking, explaining the need for meta-ethical consideration. And with the emotional driving forces that help to create these 5 main ethical philosophical positions being as shown here, namely aggression, compassion, self-esteem and self-pity, vectoring as shown with positivity top right and negativity by convention bottom left. With positivity related to low aggression and high self-esteem being associated with idealism, truth, analysis, selflessness, emotional stability, ecstasy and metaphysics. The central area being neither aggressive or passive, with intermediate levels of self-esteem, is the natural home of empiricism, calmness and reason. Negativity related to high aggression and low self-esteem, however, at the other end of the philosophical dimension, is associated with skepticism, cynicism, selfishness, being psychologically unstable, sullen, and being materialistic. But so far we have mainly concentrated on only 3 out of the 5 zones. But to the top left, where aggression and high self-esteem rule, then rationalism seems to result. The cool guys in black, angry, bossy and dogmatic. And at bottom right, where passivity and low self-esteem are prevalent, then you find asceticism and brighter colours, as well as timidity, being submissive and open-minded. By the way, rationalists usually object to the term high self-esteem as it sounds as if you're calling them big-headed, so they much prefer to have high self-regard or be described as being confident or assertive, and the die-hard ascetics usually object to the term low self-esteem as some form of insult, preferring the words humility and concern. And this brings up a very important point to be covered in part 2, where perception of the self is really important to someone building up their personal philosophy upon a set of precepts, despite perhaps these precepts and dogmas being the polar opposite of somebody else's. In other words, low self-esteem is a recognized psychological term driving someone's ethics at a low level of insight, but humility is a higher order philosophical concept where one deliberately and consciously acts humble, and you would still feel good about yourself for doing it. Therefore, this highly predictable reaction of most people to defend their position, as it were, demonstrates the fundamental need in ethics and philosophy for a third dimension in this Cartesian system, namely insight and perspectivism, to be discussed in some detail in part 2. Now you can also see a purple line drawn at approximately 90 degrees to the philosophical axis, and it marks the halfway point along the philosophical axis. I think this should be called the line of ambivalence in philosophical matters, where people are neither idealistic or skeptical, but have their own set of more social and political priorities according to which zone they are in. And this is also a great topic for discussion in part 2. So here we see the main philosophical groups, and some of their allied philosophies arranged into their respective positions on the grid, positioned dialectically and indeed diametrically opposite their adversaries in logic, and with analysis of their defining characteristics to be discussed in part 2. In the centre we have the zone of empiricism and reason as a point of intellectual balance, which brings us back very nicely to a wonderful quote from Russell about certainty. And as Russell approaches the end of his philosophical career, he says, "The whole problem with the world is that fools and fanatics are always so certain of themselves, and wiser people so full of doubts." He also then said, echoing the Enlightenment greats, "Not to be absolutely certain is one of the essential things in exhibiting rationality or reason." Indeed, certainty, by definition firm conviction, does seem to be a peripheral phenomenon. People flock and congregate around the edges of the grid, lured there not only by leaders promoting their own versions of social order, but also by fear of ignorance and the lure of certainty itself, with all the justification and self-assurance they need, to create various versions of heaven and hell on earth, and with doubt existing only in those with the most balanced views or empiricist minds. Which brings us on to the pre-Freudian dictionary definition of sanity, which is the avoidance of extreme views. And therefore, by definition, the further out on the grid we go, the more extreme our views become, to perhaps the point of insanity. And also by definition, if one goes even further out, there is risk of delusion, related to more extreme forms of cognitive distortion. And if balanced views are indeed within reason, then by definition, then those on the periphery are moving beyond reason, and those further out move beyond reality. Bringing it all together means we can consider the development of group minds, which by definition means that groups of individuals develop a collective consciousness and reinforce their beliefs. And we can look down, as it were, upon the characteristics of the main social groupings as shown, again to be discussed in Part 2. And also in Part 2 we can try to use this logic to make sense of some extreme group behaviours. Another thing we can do in Part 2 is to use the grid to analyse a particular philosopher, starting with Aristotle, the father of virtue ethics himself. In his Nicomachean Ethics Book 7, he discusses excesses, means and deficiencies. However, when mapping his dimensions, 7 out of 12 of his means, or so-called intermedios, aren't in the middle of the grid at all. They instead fall into the top right idealistic corner. In other words, he is showing marked heroic, normative, idealistic and analytic tendencies, and this ethical position seems to be his best shot at what ancient Greeks called eudaimonia, providing essential and the highest goodness and welfare for society. I'd just like to point out that he also demonstrates being pretty pro-hierarchical with his means, including being magnificent in D and ambitious in F. So, to conclude Part 1, norms of specific strength and combinations of attitudes seem to exist differentially in relation to specific areas on the psychometric philosophical grid, but by convention have tended to be generated by the idealists and routinely criticized by others. Psychometric philosophical definitions of abnorms using the grid therefore seem to be required. Synonyms and antonyms are very useful and are already available to create the ends of the dimensions and to locate meanings. This then leads to the ethical system being commensurate. Idealism, alongside objectivism and universalism, is opposed at the other end of the philosophical axis by skepticism, relativism and nihilism. The other three philosophical positions include rationalism, asceticism and empiricism, and they seem to lie in the other two corners and centre of the grid respectively. Metaethics seems to need a psychometric philosophical paradigm to quantitatively define and analyse attitudes, and to assist the understanding of certain metaethical subdivisions, in particular expressivism, emotivism and sentimentalism. Finally, the psychometric philosophical grid enables mapping and therefore determination of the nature and quality of any dialectic, including, for example, good versus evil. Russell's ethical journey, like those of others, can be mapped in such a way and seems to culminate in the central areas of opinion associated with reason and balanced opinions. Perspectivism seems related to insight and higher-order thought. It gives the ability to influence and manipulate others and seems to drive social and political events, which I hope to discuss in more detail in Part 2. And we can see insight represented here as where perspectivist thoughts rise above the basic grid, literally and metaphorically moving ideas to higher levels, and working in 3 dimensions to create a mathematical model of language and thought. We're also looking down on an amazing spectacle of people's desires and wishes, including the desire to control or be controlled.